My mother read her will at the dinner table, her voice light as if pouring tea. The house went to my brother, along with $400,000 to build his future. For me, the one who quietly kept her life from collapsing for years, she smiled and bequeathed her blessings and prayers. I smiled back, thanked her, and cleared the dishes. That night, I went home and systematically deleted every autopay keeping her lights on. My name is Avery Morris. I am 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the person people count on when they need something done right, quietly, and without a single fuss. I live on the leafy, quiet outskirts of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a modest single-story house where everything has its designated place. The lawn is always mowed, the gutters are always clean, and the bills are always paid 3 days before they are due. During the day, I work as a contract compliance manager at a private firm called Redmere Civic Systems. It is a job that requires exactness, a chronically cool head, and an eagle eye for the fine print. I am known around the office for my unflappable demeanor. When a multi-million-dollar negotiation falls apart, or a stubborn vendor blatantly breaches a critical clause, I do not panic or raise my voice. I simply read the terms, assess the financial damage, and mechanically draft the solution. I fix things behind the scenes so the people in charge can keep smiling. That is exactly what I do. It is who I am. I learned to fix things early in life because the universe gave me no other viable option. Even as a young girl in elementary school, I was the one who packed my own lunches, ironed my own school uniforms, and kept a meticulously color-coded daily planner. My grades were always remarkably stable, entirely predictable, and consistently excellent. I never asked for tutors or help with science fair projects. I picked up my first part-time job, the very moment I was legally allowed to work at age 16. Bagging groceries at the local supermarket and saving every single one of my meager paychecks in a locked-in box under my bed. But the real, irrevocable shift, the defining moment when my fierce independence calcified into a rigid, permanent state of being, happened during my freshman year of college. That was the terrible year my father, Dean Morris, was killed in a massive, multi-car collision on the interstate. He was a genuinely good man, warm and incredibly loud, the absolute center of gravity in our chaotic home. When he died, the gravity vanished instantly, and our family shattered into completely disjointed pieces. My mother, Lorraine Morris, survived the blinding shock of losing her husband by immediately seeking a brand new anchor to tie her life to. She did not look to me for comfort or stability. Instead, she clung with an absolute iron grip to her oldest child. My brother, Wyatt Morris. Wyatt is exactly 3 years older than me, and in my grieving mother's eyes, he is the walking, breathing second coming of my father. He inherited Dad's remarkably easy charm, his striking good looks, and that specific magnetic cadence of speaking that makes people naturally want to nod and agree with him. Wyatt can walk into a crowded room, flash a bright, crinkling smile, and make every single person feel like they are his oldest, dearest friend. Because of this undeniable charisma, people are perpetually soft on him. They give him second and third chances. My mother, most of all, gives him endless grace. While I was navigating the crushing weight of college grief by taking on extra weekend shifts at a diner and studying in the campus library until midnight just to keep my scholarship, Wyatt was busy spinning a massive web of endless potential. He is a man perpetually standing on the precipice of a grand, life-changing plan. Over the past decade, his entrepreneurial ventures have shifted as reliably as the Michigan seasons. First, it was vacation real estate investment, which involved a lot of glossy, expensive brochures and very little actual property ownership. Then, he confidently pivoted to becoming a boutique home sales consultant, a fancy title he essentially made up to justify going to networking lunches every Tuesday. Recently, he has been aggressively attempting to import high-end, reclaimed wood furniture to sell exclusively online. None of these ambitious ventures ever truly take off or generate actual profit, but they always require just a little more time, a little more strategic networking, and inevitably, a little more financial runway from whoever is willing to listen. To Lorraine, Wyatt's constant, dizzying pivoting is not instability, it is raw ambition. He is a brilliant dreamer, a visionary who just needs the right, lucky break to make it big. In her mind, his repeated failures are always the fault of a bad economy, uncooperative business partners, or simple, unavoidable bad luck. I, on the other hand, am categorized entirely differently in her brain. In my mother's rigid mental filing system, Avery is the strong one. Avery is the intensely independent one. Avery is the capable girl who simply does not need anyone to hold her hand or check on her. It is an incredibly dangerous thing, being labeled the strong one in a deeply flawed family dynamic. It sounds like a high compliment, but it is actually a silent life sentence. It means your daily struggles are completely invisible. Because my mother decided long ago that I was perfectly fine on my own, I was pushed entirely into the background of our family portrait. I quickly became the foundational support beam that no one ever notices until the drywall starts cracking. I was the practical, reliable problem solver, the one who quietly swept up the emotional and financial messes, the one who always arrived last to the party, but was absolutely expected to stand the firmest when the storm hit. I paid my own way through every milestone, managed my own quiet heartbreaks, and expected absolutely nothing in return. I knew deep down that asking for anything, even a moment of genuine maternal concern, would disrupt the unspoken narrative that Wyatt was the only child who desperately needed nurturing. The only person who truly sees this toxic dynamic for exactly what it is, who actually sees me, is the man I am currently dating. His name is Eli Mercer. Eli is a high school history teacher, a thoughtful man with ink-stained fingers, remarkably kind eyes, and an inherent, almost startling ability to read between the lines of human behavior. He does not look at my hyper-independence as a quirky, admirable personality trait. He sees the heavy architecture of my family weighing on my shoulders. After only a few short months of dating, Eli noticed the distinct way I immediately jumped to pay the check for dinner whenever my mother and brother were present. He noticed the way I casually and wordlessly absorbed all the logistical burdens of holiday planning. He noticed the way I never, ever asked my mother for a single favor, not even to water my plants when I was out of town. He was observant enough to realize that I was not just a naturally selfless person. I had been systematically trained, over a period of 15 long years, to silently carry the absolute heaviest burdens so the rest of my family could comfortably float. You do not have to be the shock absorber for every single bump in their road. Eli told me softly one evening as we sat on my porch watching the rain. But it is incredibly hard to unlearn a deeply ingrained role you have played your entire adult life. The tipping point, the ultimate catalyst for the complete unraveling of my meticulously constructed life, arrived on a seemingly unremarkable evening in early autumn. The air had just begun to carry that crisp, biting chill, and the neighborhood leaves were turning brilliant shades of rust and gold. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping black coffee and reviewing a particularly dense compliance report for work, when my phone vibrated against the cold marble countertop. It was a text message from my mother. Lorraine rarely organized formal family gatherings unless it was a major calendar-mandated holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas. Usually, her interactions consisted of dropping by my house completely unannounced to complain about the changing weather, or asking me to look at a strange, rattling noise her old car was making. But this message was decidedly different in tone. She formally asked me and Eli to come to her house for dinner on Thursday night. She specifically mentioned that Wyatt would be attending too. "I have something important to clarify with all of you," her text read, the words surprisingly polite and carefully structured. "I want to make sure everything is laid out clearly right now, so there are absolutely no misunderstandings later." It was a perfectly courteous sentence. It sounded highly responsible. It sounded like the exact kind of proactive, healthy communication any functional family would enthusiastically engage in. But as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, staring down at the glowing screen of my phone, A cold, incredibly heavy knot formed deep in the pit of my stomach. In the Morris family universe, clarification was rarely about mutual understanding or bringing people closer together. It was almost always about setting the elaborate stage for Wyatt's next grand act. It was a polite, well-dressed opening line specifically designed to camouflage an approaching earthquake. I just had no idea, at that precise moment, that the earthquake was deliberately meant to bury me completely. Exactly 4 years ago, my mother's physical body forced her into an early, unplanned retirement. Severe rheumatoid arthritis had aggressively gnawed at her joints, and a cascading series of chronic blood pressure spikes made her daily administrative desk job entirely impossible to maintain. On paper, her financial reality should have drastically altered the moment she handed in her notice. She transitioned to a strictly fixed income, surviving entirely on a modest state pension and monthly disability distributions. By all fundamental laws of basic household economics, her standard of living should have immediately contracted. The premium cable television packages should have been canceled. The central heating thermostat should have been kept significantly lower during the bitter Michigan Januaries. The weekly grocery hauls should have pragmatically shifted from expensive name brands to generic labels. But absolutely none of that happened. Her life remained incredibly comfortable, utterly uninterrupted by the harsh, biting realities of a fixed income. Her lifestyle did not degrade because I quietly, methodically became the invisible mortar filling every single newly formed crack in her financial foundation. Every single month, a silent hemorrhage occurred behind the glowing screen of my personal laptop. I deliberately set up automatic routing numbers and linked my primary checking account to every one of her essential utilities. I paid the electricity bill, which always spiked aggressively in the summer months, because she absolutely refused to turn off the central air conditioning. I paid the natural gas invoice. I covered the comprehensive cell phone family plan, a bloated contract that ironically included my brother's premium unlimited data usage. I paid her auto insurance premiums in full every 6 months so she would not incur installment fees. Beyond those concrete, printed invoices, I established a recurring automatic bank transfer that hit her checking account on the 25th of every single month. $500, moved silently through the digital ether. It was a designated cash cushion just to ease the pressure at the end of the month, she would say, her voice trembling slightly on the telephone the very first time she asked for the favor. That temporary emotional request instantaneously became a permanent, unspoken entitlement. Yet, the predictable monthly bleeding was practically nothing compared to the catastrophic, sudden emergencies. Home ownership is a relentless engine of depreciation, and her aging, poorly maintained house was constantly breaking down. During the second week of a brutal, sub-zero February freeze, her ancient basement furnace finally gasped its last mechanical breath and died completely. I did not hesitate. I could not consciously let an elderly woman freeze in her own living room. I called the emergency HVAC service, authorized the premium weekend dispatch fee, and paid $7,800 for a brand-new, high-efficiency heating system. When the wooden floorboards of her back porch succumbed to severe dry rot a year later, creating a legitimate safety hazard for anyone walking out to the yard, I was the one who sourced and hired the local contractor. I handed over $3,200 to replace the damaged support beams and decking. I did not ask her for a repayment plan. I just absorbed the massive financial hit, internally adjusting my own budget to accommodate her crumbling infrastructure. The medical expenses formed an entirely separate black hole. When she required a complex partial knee replacement, her Medicare coverage left a substantial, gaping hole in the billing. I covered the $850 surgical copay before she even rolled into the operating room. I paid for the out-of-pocket physical therapy sessions she needed to walk properly again. I continuously managed the recurring pharmacy tabs for her daily blood pressure medications and specialized pain management prescriptions. Then came the consumer debt. One rainy Sunday afternoon, while visiting her house to fix a leaking kitchen faucet she had been complaining about, I noticed a premium credit card statement lying wide open on the dining room table. The final balance was printed in thick, bold red ink. She caught me looking at the paper and immediately burst into defensive tears, claiming it was just an unusually tough month, a temporary, unavoidable lapse in her normally careful budgeting. It was not a lapse. It was a clear pattern of reckless, unchecked spending successfully disguised as victimhood. I sat down at her desktop computer, logged into her secure banking portal, and wiped out the $6,422 of debt in a single, devastating transaction. I desperately convinced myself I was buying her peace of mind. In harsh reality, I was fully subsidizing a deep delusion. This invisible financial pipeline flowed consistently for 48 consecutive months. The total amount of money I spent grew exponentially, quarter by quarter, year by year. It became a monstrous, shadowy figure lingering ominously at the very edge of my daily consciousness. I actively, stubbornly refused to open a blank spreadsheet and calculate the exact mathematical sum. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if I ever forced myself to stare directly at the final, cumulative number, my chest would cave in. The sheer, suffocating weight of the sacrifice would crush my ability to function at my demanding job. So, I employed the exact coping mechanism I had rigorously perfected since childhood. I compartmentalized the bleeding. I buried myself in my complex corporate workload, took on extra consulting projects on the weekends, and simply focused on out-earning the massive financial drain my mother represented. While I was quietly bleeding out my hard-earned savings, my brother Wyatt was enthusiastically perfecting the fine art of performative devotion. Wyatt's contribution to our mother's daily survival required absolutely zero capital. His chosen currency was entirely based on public optics. He would appear at her house precisely at noon on a random Tuesday, smelling of expensive designer cologne, to whisk her away for a mid-priced patio lunch. He would capture a glowing, perfectly filtered selfie of the two of them clinking their iced teas together. He would promptly post the image to all his social media accounts with a lengthy, emotionally manipulative caption about deeply honoring the woman who sacrificed absolutely everything for her children. At crowded family barbecues, while I was trapped in the sweltering kitchen aggressively scrubbing baked-on grease off the heavy roasting pans, Wyatt would stand in the direct center of the living room, completely surrounded by our easily impressed aunts and uncles. He would thoughtfully drape his heavy arm protectively over our mother's frail shoulders, press a gentle kiss to her temple, and declare in a loud, resonant voice designed to carry across the room, "I am always right here for you, Mom. You never have to worry about a single thing as long as I am around." He never paid a single overdue utility bill. He never stood in line at a pharmacy to buy a single necessary prescription. He never once asked how the exorbitant county property taxes were magically getting paid every single year. The most devastating betrayal, however, was not Wyatt's sheer audacity or his hollow promises. It was my mother's active, willing complicity in completely rewriting reality. I discovered this highly toxic narrative entirely by accident during one of those chaotic family gatherings. I was quietly walking up the carpeted hallway to the guest bathroom when I overheard my mother talking to her older sister, Aunt Ruth, through a partially open bedroom door. Ruth had gently asked how Lorraine was genuinely managing financially on such a restricted fixed income, given the rising costs of groceries and utilities. My mother's casual response physically stopped my heart in my chest. "Oh, Wyatt is really stepping up," my mother had said smoothly, her tone dripping with intense, manufactured maternal pride. "He is helping me out so much financially right now. He is my absolute rock through all of this." I held my breath in the dim hallway, desperately waiting for my name, waiting for just a tiny fraction of acknowledgement for the thousands of dollars I had poured into her survival. "And Avery?" Ruth had asked, probing slightly. My mother sighed loudly, a soft, highly dismissive sound that conveyed volumes of mild disappointment. "You know how Avery is. She is incredibly consumed with her corporate career. She chips in a little bit here and there when she can find the time, but she is just so intensely busy building her own life. I really hate to bother her with my little problems." I stood completely frozen on the carpet, the blood rushing violently in my ears. I was not the savior. I was not the sturdy pillar quietly holding up the collapsing roof. In the official, deeply entrenched family mythology, I was nothing but the distant, career-obsessed daughter casually tossing loose spare change at her poor, struggling mother, while Wyatt, the majestic golden son, heroically carried the immense burden of her survival. It was a staggering, breathtakingly cruel lie. I did not burst into the room and confront her that day. I swallowed the bitter, burning bile in my throat, turned around, walked back to the kitchen, and methodically continued washing the dirty serving dishes. I carefully packed that massive betrayal away in the exact same dark, locked mental vault where I kept the terrifying sum of my financial contributions. It was Eli who finally forced me to truly look at the heavy vault I was dragging around. During a quiet Friday evening at his apartment, I had been anxiously reviewing my mobile banking application, obsessively checking to make sure my mother's homeowner's insurance check had cleared the account before I dared to book our flights for a modest weekend getaway. Eli gently reached across the sofa cushions and pulled the phone directly out of my hands. He placed it face down on the wooden coffee table. He looked at me with an expression of profound, aching sadness. He had quietly observed the warped dynamics for months. He had accidentally seen the overwhelming stack of receipts on my desk. He had watched me physically flinch every single time my mother's name unexpectedly illuminated my phone screen. The most dangerous part of this entire situation is not that Wyatt is a lazy opportunist, Eli said, his voice incredibly low and steady. The terrifying part is that your entire family system has completely commodified your stability. They look at you, and they do not see a human being with limits. They do not see a daughter who might occasionally need a safety net of her own. They see an infinite, self-replenishing resource, a bottomless well. And because the well never complains, because you never scream out loud when they aggressively lower the bucket to take more water, they feel absolutely zero obligation to be grateful. They do not think you need to be thanked, because they genuinely believe you do not feel the crushing weight of everything they are taking. His quiet words hit me with the blunt, devastating force of a physical blow to the ribs. He had accurately articulated the exact, suffocating truth I had spent 4 long years desperately trying to ignore. I was not merely being taken for granted by my own blood. I was being actively, systematically consumed. The drive to my mother's house took exactly 45 minutes. She lived in a sleepy, aging township, nestled against the muddy banks of a small, forgotten lake. Eli and I pulled into the cracked asphalt driveway at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, exactly the time she had requested. Wyatt, true to his established, lifelong pattern, arrived nearly 40 minutes late. He walked through the front door in a flurry of rushed apologies and charming excuses, closely followed by his newest girlfriend, Tessa Vale. Tessa was a sharp-eyed, intelligent woman who worked in corporate public relations. She had only been dating my brother for about 6 months, making her entirely oblivious to the deeply entrenched toxic currents flowing beneath our family's polished surface. But as she politely shook off her coat, her quick, assessing gaze told me she was already trying to read the room. The dining room table was practically groaning under the weight of the meal. My mother had prepared a painfully elaborate spread. A massive glazed ham, heavily creamed potatoes, roasted asparagus imported out of season, and 2 distinct types of freshly baked pies. It was a staggering amount of food for 5 people, more unsettling than the menu. However, was my mother's demeanor. She was dripping with an artificial, almost suffocating sweetness. She aggressively complimented Tessa's blouse. She continuously refilled Eli's water glass before he could even take a meaningful sip. She fluttered around the dining chairs with the nervous, electric energy of a stage actor waiting for the final curtain call. I chewed my food methodically, tasting absolutely nothing. My spine was rigid against the wooden back of my chair. I knew this hyper-attentive, sugary performance intimately. It was the heavy, suffocating perfume used to mask the scent of a trap. As soon as the dessert plates were formally cleared, the clinking of silverware abruptly ceased. The manufactured warmth in the room vanished, replaced by a sudden, clinical chill. My mother stood up, smoothed her linen napkins, and walked over to the antique mahogany credenza. She opened the top drawer and retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. She placed it dead center on the dining table, right next to a half-empty gravy boat. "I met with a lawyer in town earlier this week," she began, her voice suddenly adopting a rehearsed, businesslike cadence. "I am getting older, and I want to make sure everything is laid out clearly right now. I do not want any messy legal surprises or ugly family arguments later on. I want complete clarity." Wyatt suddenly looked incredibly fascinated by the intricate floral pattern on his porcelain dessert plate. He did not look up. He did not meet my eyes. He already knew. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest, but I kept my face perfectly, rigidly blank. My mother opened the folder and smoothed the crisp, legal-sized papers with her pale hands. "The house, of course, will be left entirely to Wyatt," she stated, her tone entirely conversational, as if she were reading a grocery list. She paused slightly, ensuring we were all paying strict attention. "And then, there is the liquid capital, as you both know. When my aunt passed away 3 years ago, she left me a sizable tract of undeveloped commercial land. I quietly sold that property a few months ago. The proceeds from that sale, combined with the subsequent market investments, amount to exactly $400,000. She looked directly at my brother. A soft, deeply maternal smile spread across her face. "I am leaving the entire sum of $400,000 exclusively to Wyatt in an untouchable trust. Wyatt has such brilliant, massive visions. He has so much raw, untapped potential, but the current economic climate is just so terribly unforgiving. He needs a big, substantial push to finally make things happen. He needs a solid, concrete foundation to build a proper home and a real family. This money will be his ultimate safety net." The air in the dining room became instantly, oppressively thin. I felt Eli's large, warm hand slide slowly off his own knee and find my leg beneath the heavy tablecloth. My mother then slowly turned her head. Her eyes met mine. There was absolutely zero malice in her expression. There was no guilt, no hesitation, no trace of internal conflict. Instead, she looked at me with a profound, sickeningly proud sense of righteousness. Her logic was entirely perfectly sound in her own warped universe. "Avery," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle, soothing register, "you are so incredibly strong. You have your demanding corporate job. You have your pristine credit score. You always know exactly how to manage. If you fall down, you simply dust your knees off and get right back up. You do not need a financial safety net, because you are your own safety net." She reached across the table, her fingers grazing the edge of my placemat. "So, for your portion of the inheritance, my beautiful, capable daughter, I am leaving you my blessings and my prayers. Because there are some things in this world far more valuable than cold, hard cash, and I know, deep in my heart, that you will understand that eventually, total, suffocating silence descended upon the room. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the violent, ringing silence that immediately follows a devastating car crash. Wyatt remained completely frozen, his chin tucked down, his eyes glued to his half-empty water glass. Acting as if he were entirely invisible, beside him, Tessa was completely still. Her jaw had slightly unhinged. She looked rapidly back and forth between my mother and Wyatt, her sharp eyes widening as the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the arrangement finally registered in her brain. She was witnessing a financial execution disguised as maternal wisdom. Underneath the table, Eli's fingers wrapped tightly around my wrist. His grip was a lifeline, a silent, desperate plea asking me if I needed to run, if I needed him to flip the table, if I needed to scream. But I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not demand to know how she could hand my brother nearly $500,000 while I was secretly, desperately draining my own checking account every single month just to keep the lights turned on in the very house she had just gifted him. I felt the familiar, heavy vault in my mind slam completely shut, locking away the betrayal, the thousands of dollars, the The 4 years of quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice. A strange, icy calm washed over me. It was the purest, most terrifying clarity I had ever experienced in my entire life. I looked directly into my mother's waiting, expectant eyes. I let the corners of my mouth turn upward into a smooth, perfectly practiced, entirely hollow smile. "Thank you, Mom," I said clearly. Her shoulders immediately dropped in profound relief. She beamed, practically vibrating with the satisfaction of a successfully executed plan. "I told you, Wyatt," she chirped happily. Looking back at my brother, "I told you she would understand. Avery always understands." I did not stay for coffee. I politely excused myself, citing an early morning compliance meeting at the firm. Eli and I walked out the front door, got into his car, and drove away from the dark, quiet lake. We did not speak a single word for the entire 45-minute drive back to my house. He did not ask how I was feeling, because he knew any spoken word would shatter the fragile, icy shell keeping me intact. When we finally walked through my front door, I did not take off my coat. I walked straight into my home office and sat down in my ergonomic leather chair. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh, blue glare. I opened my primary banking portal. I navigated directly to the automated payments dashboard. It took exactly 14 minutes. 14 minutes to dismantle 4 years of invisible, suffocating labor. I found the local utility company routing number. Cancel payment. I located the natural gas provider. Delete account link. I selected the comprehensive cellular family plan. Terminate recurring charge. I found the property insurance escrow draft. Revoke authorization. Finally, I navigated to the internal bank transfer scheduled for the 25th of the month, the $500 cushion. I clicked the red deletion button and watched the scheduled transaction vanish entirely from the digital ledger. I methodically wiped every single trace of my credit cards, my checking accounts, and my routing numbers from her existence. I did not leave a single, solitary penny attached to her name. Eli stood quietly in the doorway, watching me execute the digital slaughter. My hands did not shake. My breathing was perfectly, almost frighteningly even. When the screen finally displayed 0 pending external transactions, I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. The room plunged into absolute darkness. I had been given my blessings and my prayers. Starting tomorrow, they would have to pay the electric bill. The immediate aftermath was defined entirely by its profound, echoing silence. For 21 consecutive days following that grotesque dinner, I did not orchestrate a dramatic, explosive confrontation. I did not draft a lengthy, emotionally charged email detailing my deeply rooted grievances, nor did I flood my social media feeds with vaguely aggressive quotes about setting boundaries with toxic family members. I simply woke up, brewed my black coffee, drove to my office at Redmere Civic Systems, and meticulously executed my daily compliance audits. I effectively ghosted my own designated lifelong role. I ceased being the reliable, invisible wallet. The profound beauty of my counterattack was its absolute, terrifying passivity. I did not have to swing a heavy sledgehammer to bring the warped architecture of my family crashing down. I only had to step backward and stop holding the rotting structural beams in place. Eli watched me closely during those first 3 weeks, with a mixture of quiet awe and gentle, lingering concern. He kept waiting for the inevitable emotional crash, the predictable moment the heavy guilt would finally fracture my rigid composure, but the crushing guilt never materialized. Instead, every single morning that I woke up without obsessively checking my mobile banking application to ensure my mother's property taxes had successfully cleared, my chest felt remarkably, surprisingly hollow. It was a wonderful, intoxicating kind of hollow, the specific, physical sensation of a deeply embedded, blood-sucking parasite having been surgically, permanently removed. The true concrete consequences did not arrive immediately. The modern corporate billing cycle is built upon a foundation of polite grace periods and automated warnings. But by the first week of the following month, those protective, invisible buffers completely evaporated. The carefully constructed, luxurious facade of my mother's retirement finally hit a solid, unforgiving brick wall. It started, predictably, with the essential utilities. The regional electric company is famously intolerant of missed payments, especially during the volatile transitional weather months. Her account, now completely stripped of my automatic routing number, slipped quietly past the 15-day grace period. Almost simultaneously, the premium auto insurance policy lapsed, triggering an automated, highly alarming legal notice from the underwriter regarding suspended coverage. The final, fatal blow was the Neighborhood Homeowners Association maintenance fee. It was due precisely on the 1st of the month, and when the automated clearinghouse system found absolutely no linked external account to draw the $250 from, it immediately generated a harsh, aggressively worded penalty letter. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, casually reviewing a dense vendor contract, when my cell phone began vibrating violently against the polished wood table. The caller identification boldly displayed my mother's name. I politely excused myself from the meeting, stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, and pressed the green answer button. Avery, my goodness, I have been trying to reach the bank managers all morning, Lorraine began, her voice incredibly breathless, tight with genuine, unadulterated panic. The electrical company just sent me a highly aggressive email saying my account is severely past due, and the neighborhood association mailed a penalty letter threatening legal action. Your banking system must be experiencing a massive, catastrophic glitch. You need to call your branch representative right now and fix this immediately before they report me to the national credit bureaus. She sounded so entirely, genuinely convinced it was a technical error. The sheer, blinding arrogance of her assumption was practically breathtaking. It literally had not crossed her mind, even for a fleeting fraction of a second, that the infinite, unquestioning well had been deliberately, permanently capped. There is no banking glitch. Mom, I replied. My voice was incredibly calm, automatically dropping to the cool, detached, surgical register I specifically reserved for hostile corporate contract negotiations. My financial accounts are perfectly fine. I could hear the faint, static hum of the cellular connection as her brain violently struggled to process the straightforward information. What do you mean there is no glitch? The drafts did not go through. Avery, the money is not there. I took a slow, measured breath. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not inject an ounce of venom or anger into my tone. I spoke clearly and precisely, like a judge reading a final verdict. You told me at dinner that my specific portion of the inheritance was your blessings and your prayers. So, I naturally assumed you no longer required my actual money. I canceled every single payment. The silence that followed was absolute. It lasted for exactly 4 excruciating seconds. Then, the frantic panic rapidly morphed into something incredibly sharp, desperately defensive, and deeply ugly. She immediately deployed the exact same emotional artillery she had successfully utilized to manipulate our family dynamic for the past 15 years. How could you possibly do this to me? She gasped, her voice instantly cracking into a dramatic, wet sob. I am your mother. I am an elderly woman trying to survive on a fixed income. You are maliciously trying to punish me over a simple piece of paper? Over a standard legal document designed to protect your brother? I carried you for 9 months. Avery, I raised you. No decent, loving daughter in the entire world treats her own flesh and blood with such vicious, calculated cruelty. She continued to rant, rapidly throwing out specific phrases designed to trigger my deeply ingrained childhood reflexes. She loudly mentioned her rising blood pressure. She mentioned my father, heavily suggesting he would be profoundly, deeply ashamed of my current behavior. She weaponized every single emotional vulnerability she thought she still controlled. For 35 years, those carefully manufactured tears would have broken my resolve. They would have sent me frantically scrambling for my checkbook, begging for her forgiveness, desperately apologizing for causing her any undue stress. But standing in that quiet corporate hallway, holding the warm phone to my ear, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical observation. The heavy emotional manipulation simply slid off me like water off a heavily waxed pane of glass. When she finally paused to catch her breath, waiting for my inevitable, groveling apology to fill the void, I delivered a single, surgical strike. "I suppose Wyatt will have to start taking care of his massive investment now," I said softly. "When exactly does he plan to pay your overdue electric bill?" I did not wait for her to formulate a weeping response. I firmly pressed the red button and ended the connection. The secondary explosion happened exactly 45 minutes later. Wyatt called. I had fully anticipated his swift intervention. He viewed himself as the ultimate, unquestioned authority figure in the family, the benevolent patriarch who occasionally needed to step in and severely discipline his unruly, difficult younger sister. "What the hell is exactly wrong with you? Avery?" he barked the very second I answered the call. Completely skipping any form of standard, polite greeting, Mom is practically having a severe nervous breakdown in her living room. She is crying hysterically. You are completely overreacting to the details of the will. You cannot just maliciously cut off the essential utilities to an old woman's house out of petty, childish jealousy. Turn the automated payments back on right now, and we can all sit down and talk about this situation like rational adults. He was incredibly, foolishly confident. He truly believed he could simply order me back into quiet submission. He thought this was a temporary, emotional temper tantrum that could be easily managed with a stern, authoritative tone. I leaned against the cool glass window of the hallway, watching the busy city traffic move silently on the avenue below. "Wyatt?" I asked, my tone remarkably conversational, almost polite. "Exactly how much money have you personally given Mom over the last 4 years?" "What?" he stammered, clearly thrown completely off his balance by the sudden, unexpected shift in trajectory. "That is entirely irrelevant to what you are doing to her right now. You are acting completely unhinged. It is a very simple, incredibly straightforward mathematical question," I pressed, my voice remaining perfectly level and utterly unyielding. "Over the past 48 months, while you were busy building your various imaginary businesses and buying your expensive designer clothes, exactly how many dollars have you personally contributed to keeping the heat turned on in the house you are fully scheduled to inherit?" A thick, heavy, suffocating silence immediately settled over the cellular line. He could not answer. He could not throw out a fabricated, defensive number because he knew absolutely nothing about the actual, terrifying cost of her daily survival. He did not know what the comprehensive insurance premiums cost. He did not know the current market price of a high-efficiency basement furnace. He had lived his entire privileged adult life completely shielded from the harsh, biting mathematics of our mother's existence, safely protected by the massive, invisible wall I had built with my own paycheck. The silence stretched on, heavy and intensely revealing. It was the distinct sound of a golden child suddenly realizing the beautiful, sturdy stage he had been dancing on was actually a fragile trapdoor, and someone had just quietly removed the final locking pin. "Call me back when you finally figure out the correct number." "Wyatt," I said quietly, and hung up the phone. I walked slowly back into the empty conference room. I sat down heavily in my leather chair. My hands were perfectly, remarkably steady. My heart was beating at a slow, completely normal rhythm. Despite the inevitable, massive emotional storm I knew was rapidly gathering on the horizon, despite the deep, lingering ache of finally acknowledging that my family fundamentally did not love me the way they loved him, a brand new, incredible sensation rushed violently through my veins. It was the distinct, undeniable feeling of pure, unadulterated lightness. The heavy, suffocating yoke of a one-sided, blood-sucking obligation had finally been shattered. I was no longer an endless, unappreciated resource. For the very first time in my entire adult life, I was finally, entirely, gloriously free. It took precisely 72 hours for the family grapevine to completely warp the truth. In any highly dysfunctional family system, the narrative does not belong to the person who holds the actual facts. It firmly belongs to the person who cries the loudest. My mother was a seasoned, masterful symphony conductor of guilt, and she immediately began orchestrating her grand masterpiece. Word spread through the extended relatives, with the terrifying speed and devastation of a dry summer wildfire. The story was aggressively twisted into something almost entirely unrecognizable. According to the tearful phone calls my mother made to every aunt, uncle, and cousin who would pick up the receiver, I was a deeply bitter, profoundly greedy daughter. I was maliciously punishing a frail, elderly woman simply because I was unhappy with a perfectly reasonable estate planning decision. The messages began arriving on my mobile phone by the end of the very first week. An aunt sent a lengthy, heavily guilt-laden text message on a Thursday afternoon. A decent, God-fearing daughter never allows her own mother to sit in the dark and worry about the electric bill. The message read, "You need to pray on your hardened heart." A day later, a male cousin left a blistering, aggressive voicemail accusing me of acting out of pure, childish jealousy. He confidently stated that I was simply resentful of my brother's natural charm and was lashing out because I could not handle being the second favorite. Through it all, my mother meticulously maintained her carefully crafted fiction regarding my brother. She continued to tell the extended family that Wyatt was, as always, her steadfast rock. She claimed he was still helping her financially on a regular basis, explaining away his distinct lack of visible intervention by insisting that he simply preferred to keep his immense generosity private and did not like to show off. In her grand, tragic tale, Wyatt was the humble, quiet savior, while I was the erratic, emotionally unstable daughter who had suddenly and inexplicably turned ice cold. The overwhelming instinct for any person backed into an unfair corner is to scream. The natural, human reaction is to desperately call every single relative, defend your tarnished honor, and aggressively explain the suffocating truth. I did not do that. I absolutely refused to roll around in the emotional mud they had prepared for me. Instead, I treated the entire escalating situation exactly like I treated a hostile vendor dispute at Redmere Civic Systems. I became a silent, meticulous archivist. Every time a furious voicemail illuminated my phone screen, I did not delete it. I saved the pristine audio file to a secure, encrypted cloud folder. Every time a relative sent a manipulative text message, I captured a high-resolution screenshot and cataloged it strictly by date and time. Most importantly, I began the rigorous, unflinching process of downloading my complete financial history. I pulled every single banking statement, every canceled check, and every digital transfer receipt spanning the last 48 months. I highlighted the utility payments, the medical copays, the emergency home repairs, and the recurring monthly cash transfers. I was quietly, methodically building an impenetrable fortress of hard, undeniable data. I did not need to scream because the numbers would eventually speak with absolute, deafening clarity. With the massive, invisible weight of my mother's expenses finally lifted off my shoulders, a profound shift occurred in my daily reality. At work, I channeled every ounce of my newly reclaimed energy into a massive, highly complex contract audit. The firm was reviewing a multi-million-dollar municipal logistics agreement that had been stalled in negotiations for nearly 6 months. I tore through the dense legal jargon with a level of sharp, predatory focus I had not possessed in years. I identified 3 massive liability loopholes that the previous legal team had completely missed. During the quarterly review meeting, the senior partners did not just praise my catch. They formally noted my name as the primary, leading candidate for the newly vacant position of Director of Contract Operations. But the most staggering change was the quiet, profound peace of my personal finances. When the first of the month rolled around, I logged into my banking application and watched something truly miraculous happen. The money simply stayed there. The $500 I used to blindly transfer into the abyss remained safely in my checking account. The hundreds of dollars previously earmarked for her utilities and auto insurances piled up, creating a thick, protective buffer I had never allowed myself to experience. For the first time in my adult life, I began to actively invest in my own existence. I immediately registered for an advanced compliance certification program I had been indefinitely postponing for exactly 3 years because I could never justify the hefty enrollment fee. I took my aging, reliable sedan to the local mechanic and finally paid the $450 to replace the dangerously worn brake pads, a completely necessary maintenance task I had ignored because I had needed that exact amount of cash to fix my mother's rotting back porch. I also began to seriously, deeply visualize a concrete future with Eli. One evening, as we were standing in my small kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, I confessed that a tiny, lingering part of me felt guilty for completely ignoring the barrage of angry family messages. I asked him if my absolute silence was too cruel, if I was becoming just as cold and unfeeling as they consistently accused me of being. Eli set down his knife, wiped his hands on a linen kitchen towel, and looked at me with those steady, incredibly grounding eyes. "Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty," he said softly, his voice echoing beautifully in the quiet room. "Cruelty is watching someone drown while you have a perfectly good life raft and consciously choosing not to throw it. You were the one drowning. Avery, setting a boundary is simply the way an adult protects whatever small piece of themselves they have left. You are not punishing them. You are just finally refusing to be consumed anymore." His quiet words became my daily armor. I wore them every single time my phone buzzed with another toxic accusation. I remained perfectly, infuriatingly silent, letting my family exhaust themselves against my newly reinforced walls. I did not need to fight them in the dark. I just needed to wait for the sun to rise. However, the absolute beauty of a massive structural lie is that it requires constant, exhausting maintenance to keep from completely collapsing. My mother was spinning far too many contradictory plates in the air, and it was only a matter of time before one of them shattered on the floor. The first person to truly sense the deep, structural inconsistencies in the family narrative was not my brother. Wyatt was far too insulated by his own supreme arrogance and mounting secret debts to notice the subtly shifting tides. The person who finally felt the sharp edge of the truth poking through the thin fabric of the lie was Ruth Givens. Ruth was my mother's older cousin, a fiercely sharp, remarkably pragmatic woman who did not easily tolerate emotional theatrics. She lived 3 towns over and had always maintained a slightly detached, highly observant relationship with our specific branch of the family tree. The fatal crack in the facade appeared during a routine Tuesday afternoon phone call. My mother, completely desperate for an audience and rapidly running out of actual liquid cash, had called Ruth to weep extensively about her current, dire financial state. She complained bitterly that she was suddenly forced to buy generic brand groceries and keep her winter thermostat set uncomfortably low because I had completely and callously abandoned her. But in the exact same breath, driven entirely by her pathological need to fiercely protect the golden child's public image, my mother confidently reiterated her favorite, deeply worn lie. She assured Ruth that Wyatt was still stepping up, that he was carrying her so much through this dark, incredibly difficult time, and that his quiet, steadfast generosity was the only thing keeping a roof over her head. Ruth was not a foolish woman. She had meticulously managed the intricate bookkeeping for her late husband's plumbing business for 35 years. She understood basic mathematics. She understood that if Wyatt was truly providing the massive, substantial financial support my mother constantly bragged about, my mother would not be weeping over the rising cost of basic utility bills. The equation was fundamentally, undeniably broken. The abject victimhood and the proud bragging could not logically exist in the exact same space. Ruth did not immediately confront my mother on the telephone. She simply hummed sympathetically, formally ended the call, and sat entirely alone in her quiet living room, staring thoughtfully at the floral wallpaper. The heavy seed of doubt had been firmly, irrevocably planted. And unlike the rest of my willfully blind family, Ruth Givens was the exact type of woman who would gladly grab a heavy shovel and start digging until she struck the absolute, undeniable truth. The text message from Ruth Givens arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was brief, sharply worded, and entirely devoid of the emotional manipulation that heavily characterized the rest of my family's recent communications. She simply asked if I had time for a cup of coffee at a small, independent diner situated exactly halfway between our respective towns. I agreed to the meeting. However, I did not walk into that diner empty-handed. I carried a thick, incredibly heavy manila envelope containing the exact, terrifying architecture of my last 4 years. When I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from Ruth, she did not immediately launch into a rehearsed, tearful speech about familial duty, loyalty, or religious forgiveness. She ordered 2 black coffees from the waitress, folded her hands deliberately on the laminated tabletop, and looked directly into my eyes. She stated bluntly that she had spoken extensively to my mother the previous evening. She stated that the mathematics of my mother's tragic story fundamentally did not make any sense. For the first time in many long months, I finally opened my mouth and spoke the absolute truth. I did not raise my voice, and I did not shed a single tear. I calmly unclasped the metal prongs of the envelope and slid the meticulously organized stack of printed bank statements, utility receipts, and contractor invoices directly across the table. I walked her through every single line item with the cold, detached precision of a corporate auditor. I showed her the invoice for the emergency furnace replacement. I pointed out the specific dates of the medical copays, the property insurance drafts, and the recurring monthly cash transfers. I explained, in a voice as flat and unyielding as a sheet of ice, exactly how many times my financial stability had been treated as an infinite, unacknowledged natural resource by the people who were supposed to protect me. Ruth is a remarkably pragmatic woman who spent 3 decades balancing the highly intricate, unforgiving ledgers of a commercial plumbing business. She knows intimately how to read a financial history. As her sharp eyes scanned the highlighted rows of numbers, her normally stoic, impenetrable expression visibly fractured. The sheer volume of the financial drain was staggering enough, but it was the realization of the massive, meticulously orchestrated lie that truly shook her foundation. She sat back heavily against the vinyl seat, the color completely draining from her face, as she finally understood that my mother had fabricated a completely fictional reality for the entire extended family. Instead of rushing to the nearest telephone to angrily confront her cousin, Ruth executed a remarkably brilliant, tactical maneuver. She played entirely into my mother's manufactured narrative of helpless, desperate victimhood. 2 days after our coffee meeting, Ruth drove directly to my mother's house carrying a fresh legal pad and a pocket calculator. She gently offered to help my mother aggressively restructure her supposedly tight monthly budget, suggesting they look closely for hidden subscription fees or wasteful grocery spending to somehow save the month and keep the lights turned on. My mother, desperately eager to maintain the convincing illusion of absolute poverty and always craving a sympathetic audience, eagerly agreed to the exercise. She booted up her desktop computer and logged directly into her primary checking account portal, unwittingly allowing Ruth full, unrestricted visual access to her digital transaction history. What Ruth found buried deep within those digital ledgers was not a simple, tragic case of a fixed retirement income failing to meet the rising, cruel costs of modern inflation. It was a massive, systematic funnel. Ruth called me late the following evening. Her voice was incredibly tight, practically vibrating with a potent mixture of profound disgust and sheer disbelief. She had taken covert photographs of the computer screen with her cellular phone when my mother had briefly stepped into the kitchen to brew a pot of tea. She immediately emailed the encrypted image files directly to my secure inbox. I opened the files on my laptop, and the final, devastating pieces of the puzzle violently slammed into their proper places. A distinct, undeniably parasitic pattern emerged from the long columns of black and red text. During the exact same months that I was quietly absorbing the heavy, crushing blows of my mother's property taxes, her inflated electrical bills, and her premium auto insurance payments, my mother was actively executing substantial outbound wire transfers. The destination routing number for every single one of those transfers belonged to an account registered exclusively to Wyatt Morris. The amounts were absolutely staggering: $1,000 sent on a Tuesday, $1,500 wired on a Friday. Sometimes, just 3 days after my own automated transfer hit her account to provide that supposed emergency end-of-the-month cushion, she would wire an almost identical sum directly to my brother's bank. My money had never actually been keeping my mother from going under. My money had been deliberately and systematically utilized to completely subsidize her basic living expenses, thereby entirely freeing up her own pension and disability income. She had weaponized my deeply ingrained sense of duty, transforming my quiet sacrifice into a secret, flowing river of untraceable cash for her favorite, golden child. But the revelations did not simply stop at the crude mechanics of the financial theft. Ruth had also quietly tapped into her extensive network of local county clerks and real estate acquaintances to figure out exactly where that river of stolen cash was flowing. Wyatt was not just buying expensive designer clothes or financing a luxurious, superficial lifestyle in the city. He had secretly purchased a dilapidated, severely damaged cabin situated on the muddy edge of a popular recreational lake 3 counties over. He had acquired the property using a high-interest, predatory private loan, fully intending to execute a rapid cosmetic renovation and quickly transform the rotting structure into a highly lucrative short-term vacation rental. It was his ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, the grand, visionary real estate project that was finally going to boldly prove his business genius to the entire world. However, Wyatt fundamentally lacked the discipline, the work ethic, and the operational capital required to execute such an ambitious turnaround. The local municipal zoning board had completely suspended his renovation permits due to severe structural instability and blatant environmental code violations. The critical, highly profitable summer tourist season had already come and gone, leaving the property entirely vacant, unfinished, and aggressively bleeding money. The massive private loan payments were absolutely crushing him. As I sat perfectly still in the quiet dark of my home office, staring intensely at the glowing screen, the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of the betrayal washed over me like a heavy wave of freezing water. I had not just been carrying my mother's burdens, I had been completely transformed into the silent, unwitting angel investor for my brother's incredibly foolish, rapidly failing real estate delusions. I was actively funding his arrogant, reckless ambitions with the money I had earned through grueling, 80-hour work weeks and permanently canceled vacations. I had financed his glittering dream without ever being asked for my consent, without ever being informed of the investment, and without receiving a single, solitary word of gratitude. They had comfortably stolen my present security to artificially prop up his imaginary future. Ruth did not call me solely to deliver the forensic financial evidence. She called to deliver a highly urgent, incredibly dangerous warning regarding the immediate future. My mother was rapidly, terrifyingly running out of time. Without my invisible, reliable wallet constantly absorbing her daily household expenses, the excess money she usually funneled directly to Wyatt was completely, permanently gone. Wyatt's private lenders were aggressively closing in, and his entire fragile house of cards was violently swaying in the wind. Pure, unadulterated desperation was rapidly setting in across their entire ecosystem. "She is organizing a formal gathering," Ruth warned me, her tone dropping into a low, deadly serious register. "She has formally asked me to host it at my house next weekend because my living room is the largest. She is publicly calling it a family healing circle, but you and I both know exactly what kind of trap it really is. She is heavily inviting all the aunts, the loud uncles, and everyone who has already completely bought into her tearful victim narrative. They are going to strategically corner you. Avery. They are planning a full-scale psychological intervention to systematically break your spirit, isolate you from any support, and apply absolute, overwhelming group pressure until you finally break down and agree to turn the money back on before Wyatt loses his property. They wanted to put me on trial. They actively intended to parade my supposed cruelty and selfishness in front of an angry, deeply biased jury of my own blood relatives, heavily banking on my lifelong childhood habit of retreating into silent submission whenever I was forcefully challenged. They genuinely believed that if they shamed me deeply enough, if they attacked my moral character loudly enough in a crowded room. I would eventually cave to the pressure and immediately resume my designated role as the endless, compliant resource. I quietly thanked Ruth for the vital information and gently ended the cellular connection. I sat in the darkness for a long time. I did not feel the familiar, suffocating panic that usually accompanied my mother's strategic emotional manipulations. I did not feel the overwhelming, cowardly urge to hide or run away. I looked at the thick stack of printed financial documents resting heavily on my desk. I looked at the undeniable photographic evidence of the secret, parasitic transfers illuminating my screen. For 35 years, I had quietly allowed them to write the definitive story of who I was. I had passively let them cast me as the cold, reliable background character, while they continuously played the tragic, misunderstood heroes on a glittering stage built entirely with my stolen wages. They wanted a dramatic family intervention. They wanted to drag everything out into the harsh light of day and force a final reckoning. I calmly gathered the papers, aligned the sharp edges perfectly against the mahogany desk, and placed them securely back into the heavy manila envelope. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable girl who would silently absorb their heavy blows just to keep a toxic peace. I was a meticulous corporate professional armed with lethal, irrefutable data, and I was finally completely ready to attend their little meeting. The magnificent, highly lucrative lake house project that my brother had endlessly boasted about at family gatherings was quietly, violently imploding. Wyatt had always been a man who operated entirely on surface-level aesthetics, fundamentally lacking the deep, structural discipline required to execute an actual business turnaround. The dilapidated cabin he had purchased with a high-interest, predatory private loan was practically bleeding capital every single day. The structural renovations were severely delayed, held hostage by exorbitant contractor fees he could no longer afford to pay. Worse, the local municipal council had recently enacted stringent zoning regulations, severely restricting short-term vacation rentals in the immediate area. The highly anticipated tourist season arrived and vanished, leaving his booking calendar a vast, empty expanse. The crushing balloon payment on his private loan was rapidly approaching, and his imaginary real estate empire was collapsing under its own hollow weight. Tessa Vale, equipped with the sharp, analytical mind of a public relations professional, was the very first person in his immediate orbit to genuinely detect the distinct scent of his desperation. She began noticing the subtle, terrifying discrepancies in his grand narrative. Wyatt had aggressively sold her a highly intoxicating vision of their shared future, one built entirely on assets he did not actually possess. He had confidently assured Tessa that the massive inheritance of $400,000 from our mother's trust was an absolute, guaranteed certainty, framing it as their ultimate financial launchpad. He spoke of my mother's current suburban home as the perfect collateral they would eventually leverage to permanently upgrade their lifestyle. Tessa began to realize, with a mounting sense of profound disgust, that Wyatt was not a successful entrepreneur standing on the precipice of greatness. He was living entirely on an elaborate facade, surviving on promises backed by wealth that belonged to a woman who was still very much alive. Meanwhile, back in her aging suburban home, my mother was finally experiencing the terrifying, biting reality of true financial scarcity. With my invisible, heavily funded safety net permanently dismantled, the essential invoices were piling up rapidly on her kitchen counter. The electric company was threatening disconnection. The natural gas provider had issued a final warning. Naturally, in a state of sheer panic, she turned to her golden child. She tearfully asked Wyatt to temporarily shoulder the heavy utility costs I had previously managed without a single complaint. When the actual, concrete burden of survival was finally placed squarely upon Wyatt's broad shoulders, his true pathetic nature was immediately exposed. He completely reverted to his lifelong, practiced script. He promised her the world. He loudly swore he would handle everything, adopting the tone of a fiercely protective son. But his grand promises translated into absolute, miserable failure. He would wire her a meager $50 on a Tuesday, or perhaps $75 on a Friday, barely enough to cover the accumulated late fees, let alone the massive, outstanding utility balances, when she continued to call him, desperately pleading for the remaining funds to keep the heating system functional. Wyatt deployed his ultimate defense mechanism. He simply stopped answering her phone calls. He cowardly hid behind vague text messages, claiming he was tied up in endless, crucial business meetings, effectively leaving her to drown in the very reality I had shielded her from for 4 long years. Completely unable to maneuver financially and desperate to restore the parasitic pipeline that had secretly funded his life, Wyatt realized he had to confront the source of the drought. He ambushed me late one Wednesday afternoon. I was walking out of the glass doors of the Redmere Civic Systems corporate building, heading toward the parking garage, when he stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. His designer suit looked slightly rumpled, and the effortless, charming smile he usually wore was entirely absent, replaced by a tight, aggressive grimace. He initially attempted to utilize his standard, authoritative, older brother routine. He aggressively ordered me to stop acting like a petulant, jealous child. He demanded that I immediately fix the chaotic situation I had deliberately caused, speaking to me as if I were a disobedient teenager who had broken a household rule. When I simply stood there, my expression perfectly blank and utterly unyielding, his arrogant facade violently cracked. The aggressive posture instantly dissolved into pathetic, frantic. "Avery, please, you just have to turn the electricity and water back on for Mom," he pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate, hushed tone. "At least cover those basic things. She is an old woman. She is terrified. You cannot just leave her sitting in the dark like this. It is incredibly cruel." I stood there in the chilling evening wind and saw the crude, mechanical gears of his trap with perfect, absolute clarity. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, but I was completely immune to the poison. I knew exactly what would happen if I surrendered to his frantic begging. If I quietly resumed paying those few essential utility bills, my mother's meager fixed income would instantly be freed up once again. And that exact, freed-up cash would immediately resume its secret, digital flow straight back into Wyatt's empty pockets, effectively allowing him to fend off his furious private lenders for another month. He was not begging for our mother's comfort or safety. He was frantically begging for his own financial survival. He wanted me to unknowingly finance his failing lake house under the sacred guise of filial piety. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort or agreement. I simply turned on my heel, walked to my car, and drove away, leaving him standing entirely alone in the cold shadows of the parking garage. Later that same evening, the sheer weight of the impending family collision hung heavily in the air of my living room. I sat quietly on the hardwood floor, surrounded by towering stacks of printed bank statements, utility invoices, and highlighted digital ledgers. Eli sat on the edge of the sofa, watching me meticulously sort the paperwork. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and asked me a profound, anchoring question that forced me to completely define my exact endgame. "What do you truly want out of all this, Avery?" he asked softly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. "You hold all the cards now. You can choose to just take your revenge, let them financially burn to the ground, and enjoy the show. You can choose to make a perfectly clean break, block all their numbers, and never look back. Or you can force every single one of them to finally stand in the same room and face a truth they cannot possibly bend or rewrite." I stopped sorting the papers and looked down at my hands. I did not want petty, chaotic revenge. Vengeance was a highly emotional, deeply reactive state, and I was entirely finished operating on their toxic emotional terms. I also fiercely refused to simply disappear into the night. Walking away quietly would allow my mother and my brother to permanently control the historical narrative. They would spend the rest of their lives casting me as the cruel, ungrateful villain who abandoned her family over a simple misunderstanding regarding a will. I chose the third, most difficult path. I chose the absolute, blinding light of undeniable proof. I began to construct a master dossier, treating my family's deep dysfunction with the exact same ruthless, analytical precision I applied to a multi-million-dollar corporate contract dispute. I carefully compiled every single electrical bill, every natural gas receipt, the massive contractor invoice for the emergency winter furnace replacement, the medical copays, and the comprehensive auto insurance policies. I built a rigorous, chronological timeline spanning exactly 48 months. Then, I integrated the explosive evidence Ruth had provided. I matched the exact dates of my massive utility payments with the precise dates of my mother's secret wire transfers to Wyatt. The undeniable pattern of systemic financial abuse was laid out in stark black and white ink. I printed out text messages where my mother claimed she was completely destitute, placing them right next to the banking ledgers showing she had wired my brother over $1,000 just 2 days prior. I hole-punched the massive stack of documents and locked them securely inside a thick, heavy black binder. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable girl who would silently absorb their heavy blows just to maintain a toxic peace. I was a meticulous professional armed with lethal, irrefutable data, quietly preparing for the specific day when every single beautiful artificial mask they wore would be violently ripped away at exactly the same time. The formal summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered via a carefully worded text message from my mother. She officially announced a mandatory family discussion to be held at Aunt Ruth's house that upcoming weekend. The stated purpose, according to her deeply manipulative phrasing, was to facilitate immediate healing before this unfortunate misunderstanding went too far. It was a classic Lorraine Morris tactic. By framing the gathering as a healing circle, she preemptively cast herself as the noble, forgiving matriarch desperately trying to salvage her broken family, thereby painting my sudden withdrawal as an aggressive, wounding act. I replied with a single, concise paragraph. I agreed to attend the gathering on 2 strict, non-negotiable conditions. First, Wyatt had to be physically present in the room from the very first minute to the absolute end. He would not be permitted to arrive late or leave early to conveniently dodge accountability. Second, the gathering would not operate as a one-sided tribunal where I sat in silence while the extended relatives aired their manufactured grievances. If she agreed to those specific terms, I would walk through Ruth's front door. If she refused, the conversation was permanently over. She swiftly agreed, undoubtedly believing she could easily overwhelm my boundaries once she had me completely surrounded by a captive audience. While we waited for the weekend to arrive, the crushing reality of my brother's financial incompetence rapidly accelerated. The high-interest private loan attached to his disastrous lake cabin was tightening around his neck like a heavy iron collar. Tessa, whose professional instincts were fully activated, began asking the precise, incisive questions he was entirely incapable of answering. She demanded to see the actual municipal permits he claimed were pending. She asked for the explicit legal documentation proving his ownership, and most dangerously, she requested a clear, transparent accounting of his investment capital. Wyatt could no longer hide behind his charismatic smile or vague promises of future wealth. He was completely out of runway, trapped between a girlfriend who demanded the hard truth and a mother who had run out of stolen money to feed him. Sensing the intense, mounting pressure and realizing her usual guilt trips were actively failing, my mother pivoted to a softer, far more insidious strategy. 3 days before the scheduled meeting, my phone chimed with a new message. It was a scanned image of an old, faded photograph. In the picture, I was 10 years old, sitting high on my father's broad shoulders during a summer parade. Beneath the image, she had typed a single, devastating sentence. "Your father would be absolutely heartbroken to see our family torn apart like this. It was a remarkably cruel, perfectly aimed psychological strike." For a brief, agonizing moment, staring at my father's beaming face, the heavy protective ice around my heart began to fracture. A deep, familiar wave of childhood conditioning washed over me. The overwhelming urge to simply surrender, to pay the overdue electric bill, to apologize for causing disruption, and to restore the toxic equilibrium almost brought me to my knees. I closed my eyes and took a ragged breath, the ghost of my father's booming laugh echoing in my ears. But then, I turned my chair toward my desk. I opened my laptop, bypassed the emotional noise, and accessed the master financial spreadsheet I had meticulously compiled. For the very first time, I highlighted the entire column of expenses spanning the last 4 years and clicked the automatic sum function. I finally forced myself to stare directly at the absolute bottom line. The final, cumulative total was exactly $81,000. $81,000 of my own hard-earned wages. This staggering sum encompassed the emergency winter furnace, the endless utility payments, the medical copays, the property maintenance, and the direct cash infusions that had been secretly funneled directly to my brother. It was a life-altering amount of capital. It was the down payment on a beautiful home of my own. It was a robust retirement portfolio. It was my physical labor, my delayed dreams, and my stolen security, all sacrificed on the altar of my brother's bottomless ambition. The brief, agonizing moment of weakness instantly evaporated. The ghost of my father faded, replaced by the cold, undeniable mathematics of my exploitation. Memory and nostalgia could not be utilized as a valid currency to purchase my continued submission. As if the universe perfectly understood the profound shift in my internal gravity. My corporate phone rang later that same afternoon. It was the senior managing partner at Redmere Civic Systems. He bypassed the usual corporate pleasantries and officially offered me the position of Director of Contract Operations. The promotion came with a massive salary increase, a dedicated team of junior analysts, and a corner office. He specifically praised my unflappable composure, my rigorous attention to detail, and my absolute refusal to back down during hostile negotiations. The sheer, blinding contrast between my professional reality and my family dynamic was staggering. At work, my meticulous nature and quiet strength were highly compensated and deeply respected. At home, those exact same qualities were relentlessly exploited and entirely taken for granted. I accepted the position with quiet, immense pride. Hanging up the phone, I felt an incredibly solid, unbreakable foundation form beneath my feet. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what I required to ever participate in a relationship with my family again. I clearly defined the 3 absolute conditions required for any potential reconciliation. First, my mother had to publicly admit the entire, unvarnished truth regarding her financial arrangement with Wyatt in front of the gathered relatives. Second, the current, heavily biased, will had to be completely voided and legally rewritten to reflect an exact 50-50 distribution of all assets. Third, the covert, parasitic financial pipeline sustaining my brother had to be permanently dismantled. I would not accept a single compromise. I would not entertain a partial confession. When the weekend finally arrived, the sky above Grand Rapids was heavy with thick, dark, bruised clouds. Eli drove me to Aunt Ruth's house, his presence a steady, grounding force beside me in the passenger cabin. He parked the car along the quiet residential curb. I reached into the back seat and picked up the heavy black binder containing the master dossier. "You do not have to do this if you are not ready," Eli said quietly, his hand resting gently on the steering wheel. "I am ready," I replied, my voice steady and perfectly calm. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the concrete driveway. I could see the silhouettes of my aunts and uncles moving behind the sheer living room curtains. They were waiting for the obedient, quiet girl to walk into their trap. They were waiting for the scapegoat to finally break down and beg for forgiveness. But as I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, I left that girl entirely behind. I stepped into the house not as a wounded victim hoping to finally be chosen, but as the absolute keeper of the records. I was a woman who knew the precise, unarguable cost of her own sacrifices, and I was completely prepared to ensure that no one in that room would ever be allowed to rewrite my history again. The living room was suffocatingly warm, smelling faintly of lemon furniture polish and brewed decaffeinated coffee. Ruth had arranged the seating in a deliberate, semicircular formation, effectively transforming her cozy suburban parlor into a makeshift courtroom. My mother occupied the central, plush armchair, already clutching a damp, crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. Flanking her on the floral sofa were two of our loudest, most consistently opinionated relatives, their faces pinched in preemptive disapproval, clearly primed and entirely ready to deliver their moral verdicts. Wyatt was positioned in a wingback chair near the bay window, but he looked completely alien. The effortless, magnetic charm that usually radiated from his pores had entirely evaporated. His broad shoulders were rigidly hunched, his skin carried a sickly ashen pallor, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He looked exactly like a man who knew the executioner was already walking up the front steps. Beside him sat Tessa, her spine perfectly straight, her sharp eyes scanning the room and missing absolutely nothing. I took the only remaining empty seat, placing the thick, heavy black binder squarely on my lap. My mother did not waste a single second. She launched her opening volley with a practiced, dramatic sob. "I just cannot comprehend how our family arrived at this terrible, dark place," she wept, dabbing carefully at the corners of her eyes so as not to smear her makeup. "I made a perfectly standard, completely logical estate planning decision to help my son build his future, and because she was unhappy with that decision, my own daughter ruthlessly abandoned me. She cut off my utilities without a single word of warning. She left me terrified and alone, just to punish me out of her own petty jealousy." One of the relatives, a woman who had never worked a day of corporate compliance in her entire life, leaned forward aggressively. "You simply do not turn your back on the woman who gave you life. No matter how upset you are about a piece of paper, letting your mother freeze in the dark is unforgivable." I felt the familiar, heavy pressure of their collective judgment attempting to push me down, attempting to force me back into my designated, silent role. I did not shrink. I did not offer a frantic, desperate defense. I sat perfectly still, letting their misplaced, righteous indignation fill the heavy air, before the second relative could launch into her prepared lecture on familial duty. Ruth suddenly cut through the noise. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was as sharp and unforgiving as a newly ground axe. "Lorraine," Ruth said, staring directly at her cousin, entirely immune to the theatrical tears. "Exactly how much money has she paid for you over the last 48 months? The weeping abruptly stalled. My mother blinked, clearly thrown completely off her carefully rehearsed script. "That is not the primary issue here, Ruth. The issue is her incredibly cruel behavior." "It is the only issue," Ruth interrupted coldly. "Answer the question. How much?" My mother stammered, frantically searching the room for an ally. She helped out occasionally, like any good daughter should, but Wyatt, I did not let her finish the lie. I stood up, walked to the large glass coffee table in the center of the room, and dropped the heavy black binder onto its surface. The loud thud effectively silenced the entire room. "Let us look at exactly what a good daughter does," I said. My voice was eerily calm, resonating with the absolute authority of a woman who held every single undeniable fact. I flipped the heavy cover open. "Here are the municipal gas invoices. Here are the premium auto insurance policies. Here are the comprehensive pharmacy receipts." I turned the pages methodically, letting the sheer, overwhelming volume of the paperwork speak for itself. Here is the invoice for the emergency winter heating system. $7,800, authorized and fully paid by me. Here is the credit card debt of over $6,000 that I completely wiped out on a Sunday afternoon because you claimed you were having a tight month. The two relatives on the sofa leaned in instinctively, their expressions rapidly morphing from righteous anger to profound confusion. I continued, my finger tapping against the highlighted digital ledgers. Here are the neighborhood association fees. Here is the recurring monthly transfer of exactly $500, scheduled for the 25th of every single month, designed specifically to ease your financial burden. My mother's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. "You are deliberately trying to humiliate me. Spending money does not excuse your current, terrible disrespect." "I am not humiliating you," I replied evenly. "I am simply establishing the absolute baseline of the truth. But that is only half of the story." Right on cue, Ruth stepped forward. She withdrew a sleek gray folder from beneath her arm and laid it directly next to my open binder. Because while she was paying for your survival, Lorraine, we need to look closely at what you were doing with your own pension. Ruth opened the gray folder, revealing the printed, high-resolution photographs of my mother's digital banking statements. Look closely at the outbound wire transfers. Ruth commanded the room. The relatives leaned closer, their eyes scanning the columns. On the 12th of October, just 3 days after the emergency furnace was paid for, Lorraine wired $1,500 directly to Wyatt. Ruth stated, reading the numbers aloud with surgical precision. On the 4th of November, while her daughter was paying the massive property taxes, Lorraine transferred another $1,000 to Wyatt. The pattern is completely uninterrupted. Every single month, the exact cash that was freed up by the daughter's quiet sacrifices was secretly pumped straight into the son's checking account. The silence in the living room was absolute and entirely deafening. The heavy protective curtain of my mother's grand illusion was violently ripped away, exposing the ugly parasitic machinery grinding underneath. I looked directly at my brother. Wyatt was staring intensely at his shoes. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Suddenly, a sharp intake of breath shattered the quiet. It came from Tessa. Tessa was staring down at the gray folder, her face completely pale, her intelligent eyes rapidly connecting the devastating dots. She slowly turned her head to look at Wyatt. "The custom kitchen cabinets," Tessa whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of horror and profound disgust. "The initial contractor deposits for the lake house. The expensive dinners you insisted on paying for when we first started dating. You confidently told me your real estate business was generating that cash flow." Wyatt squeezed his eyes shut and swallowed hard, completely unable to meet her furious gaze. "You did not earn a single dime of it," Tessa continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "You were building your imaginary empire using the money your sister thought she was spending to keep your mother from freezing. You stole from her. It was not stealing." My mother shrieked defensively, desperately trying to plug the massive holes in her rapidly sinking ship. "I chose to invest in my son. It was my own money to give." "It was only your money because I was paying for every other aspect of your existence," I shot back, my voice finally cutting through the room like a steel blade. "You did not invest in him. You actively conspired to drain me. You weaponized my sense of duty, my guilt, and my labor as a limitless cash machine to fully fund his delusions." The atmospheric pressure in the room had entirely inverted. The two relatives who had been so incredibly eager to condemn me mere minutes ago were now sitting back against the sofa cushions in stunned, humiliated silence. They realized they had been deliberately utilized, fed a completely fictional, highly edited narrative to help bully me back into financial submission. I stood tall above the coffee table, looking down at the scattered papers that represented 4 years of my stolen life. I was no longer the ungrateful, cold daughter they had gathered to enthusiastically punish. I was the absolute engine of that family, the secret, unacknowledged powerhouse who had single-handedly maintained their beautiful, fake story, and I had just permanently shut the engine off. The silence in Aunt Ruth's living room felt incredibly dense, heavy enough to completely shatter the wooden floorboards beneath our feet. The visual evidence of my exploitation lay scattered across the glass coffee table, an undeniable, glaring map of systemic theft and silent complicity. Wyatt remained firmly pinned to his wingback chair, the polished, sophisticated veneer of his golden boy persona entirely stripped away by the harsh fluorescent lighting. He slowly looked up, his bloodshot eyes finally meeting mine, and the absolute, raw cowardice I saw reflected there was genuinely staggering. He did not attempt to offer a smooth, rehearsed excuse. Backed into an inescapable, data-driven corner, his broad shoulders slumped forward in total, humiliating defeat. "I knew," he whispered, his voice cracking violently under the immense weight of the room's collective, condemning stare. "I knew you were the one paying her bills. Avery. I saw the utility statements with your name printed on them several months ago, when I was looking for a pen in her kitchen drawer. The two judgmental relatives sitting on the floral sofa gasped simultaneously, their hands flying to their mouths, but I kept my facial muscles rigidly controlled. "Why did you not stop it?" I asked, my tone utterly devoid of any familial warmth. Wyatt swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. "Because it made my life so much easier," he confessed, the ugly truth finally spilling out of his mouth like toxic sludge. "If you were quietly carrying her financial burdens, I did not have to worry about her. I could just focus entirely on my own real estate projects. I let you do it, and I let her give me the extra cash. Because you never once complained. You always handled everything perfectly." My mother, sensing the complete and total collapse of her carefully constructed empire, frantically attempted to salvage the remaining wreckage. "The estate will was simply a practical, forward-thinking measure," she stammered, her pale hands trembling violently as she gestured vaguely toward the black binder. "And when I offered you my blessings and prayers at the dinner table, I meant it purely in a spiritual sense. A mother's profound love and daily prayers are a wonderful, beautiful gift." I did not yell. I did not shed a single, pathetic tear. I looked directly at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had willingly sacrificed my future to artificially inflate my brother's ego, and I delivered the final, fatal blow. "You did not give me a spiritual gift," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying, absolute authority. "You gave me a calculated insult. I did not cut you off. Mom, I simply cut off a deeply toxic, parasitic system that actively used my competence and my reliability as a free, unlimited license to completely disrespect me." The sharp, sudden sound of a chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor instantly drew every eye in the room. Tessa stood up. She did not look at my mother, nor did she acknowledge the aunts. She looked straight down at Wyatt. Her previous expression of shock had entirely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute finality. "I genuinely thought you were ambitious," Tessa said, her voice ringing through the quiet parlor with crystal clarity. "I thought you were a brilliant man building a legitimate empire with your own two hands and a sharp mind. But you are nothing but a parasite. I will never marry a man who builds his supposed grand future entirely upon the silent, bleeding back of his own sister and proudly calls it ambition." She calmly picked up her expensive leather handbag from the floor, turned her back on the entire stunned family, and walked straight out the front door into the chilly evening air without looking back a single time. The sharp click of the front door latch seemed to break something fundamental and irreparable inside my brother. For the very first time in his entire 38 years of existence, there was absolutely no one left in the room willing to blindly rescue his tarnished public image. The loud relatives were stunned into silence. Ruth was glaring at him with open, unmasked disgust. Tessa was permanently gone. He looked frantically at my mother, his face incredibly pale and stricken with genuine panic. "I cannot take it," Wyatt said, his voice trembling but suddenly gaining a strange, entirely unfamiliar resolve. "I cannot take the suburban house. I cannot take the $400,000 from the trust account like this. It is incredibly dirty money. Mom, if you do not legally change that will to a strict, non-negotiable 50-50 split right now, I will formally and legally refuse every single penny of the inheritance. I will not let you do this to her anymore. I cannot be this person anymore." That specific declaration was the ultimate, fatal strike. The cherished golden child was actively, aggressively rejecting the luxurious golden cage she had built for him. My mother finally, completely broke. The manufactured, theatrical tears instantly vanished, instantly replaced by genuine, ugly, heaving sobs of a woman whose entire internal mythology had just violently collapsed around her. She buried her face deeply in her trembling hands. "You never actually needed me, Avery," she choked out, her words heavily muffled by her palms, finally speaking the dark, hidden truth that had governed our lives. "From the time you were a little girl, you could survive absolutely anything the world threw at you. You were exactly like a solid rock." But Wyatt constantly stumbled, Wyatt desperately needed me to fix things for him. I unconsciously poured every single resource I had, every ounce of my maternal tenderness, directly into him because he actively made me feel like I was still a vital, necessary mother. I punished you for being incredibly strong because your fierce independence made me feel entirely useless. It was a pathetic, deeply flawed, and profoundly selfish confession, but it was, at long last, the absolute truth. During the following week, the entire operational landscape of our family shifted permanently and irreversibly. We sat in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned downtown office of her estate lawyer. I sat silently in a leather chair, my posture perfectly straight, and watched with cold satisfaction as my mother signed the heavily amended legal documents. The new contract irrevocably split the remaining $400,000 and the future equity of the suburban house equally down the middle, exactly 50-50. Furthermore, under Aunt Ruth's strict, uncompromising, and highly aggressive supervision, my mother was legally forced to establish a highly transparent, fixed monthly budget. The secret, shadowy financial pipeline feeding my brother was permanently, solidly sealed shut. Wyatt was completely left to face the brutal, unforgiving consequences of his own reckless incompetence. Without my stolen wages secretly keeping his head above water, he was forced to immediately list the dilapidated lake cabin on the open real estate market at a massive, crushing financial loss. He desperately needed to satisfy his furious private lenders before they forced him into a highly public bankruptcy. He had to pack up his expensive designer suits and immediately move into a tiny, cramped, affordable apartment on the noisy, industrial side of the city to begin cleaning up his own catastrophic mess. As for me, I did not magically return to being the reliable, invisible rescue wallet. I did not instantly forgive them and pretend the horrific exploitation of the last 4 years was merely a bad, easily forgotten dream. Instead, I accepted an entirely new, incredibly slow, and highly restricted relationship with my family. It is a dynamic defined entirely by rigid, unbreakable boundaries, absolute financial transparency, and a hard-earned, cautious, mutual respect. We do not have warm, chaotic Sunday dinners anymore. But when we do speak on the telephone, my mother listens to my words with a new, distinct, and heavy caution. Sitting on my back porch with Eli on a quiet Sunday afternoon, drinking hot black coffee, and watching the vibrant autumn leaves fall onto the manicured lawn, I realized exactly what I had actually won. It was never truly about the money. Securing my fair half of the financial estate was simply the mechanical, legal justice I was rightfully owed for my years of stolen labor. The real victory, the profound, incredibly life-altering triumph, was forcing them to finally open their willfully blind eyes. For the very first time in my entire existence, I was no longer a convenient, invisible shadow or a bottomless, unfeeling resource. The entire family was finally forcefully compelled to look directly at me, and they were utterly terrified of the fiercely capable, unyielding woman they saw. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and please let me know down in the comments where you are currently listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I highly invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and please support the channel further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.